The Stickermen by Abysme.
My name is Celeste, and I would like to share with you a story about my husband. Maybe you all can help me. We live in a small town in Vermont, an hour outside of Burlington. I don't want to say where exactly, just in case. Last year, in the first week of January, a Stickerman appeared on our lawn. Yeah, I know the name sounds silly, and, well, it certainly is, but hear me out. Well before I was born, our town had the tradition of creating a strange, sort of non-traditional snowman. I suppose that does require some sort of brief explanation. See, they possess the typical 3-part structure, 2 orbs of snow for the body, and a final one for the head. Their main difference lays in how they're decorated. Instead of just sticks for the arms, imagine those same sticks placed in random, chaotic places. The twigs could be inserted as eyes, toes, a spinal ridge. They could be scattered atop the scalp, pretty much anywhere there was space. The more elaborate the branches, with surviving pine needles or other dead leaves, the better. The more grotesque you could make it, the more loved by the town overall. So like I said, this is a tradition that's been in our town long before I was born. That being said, I do take a bit of credit for the namesake. Back a few decades, when I was on the cusp of being a teen, the Wickerman movie had been showing in our little theater, the original 70s release. My friend Jennifer and I had snuck into multiple showings, being too young to see it. She and I talked about it a lot that year. It frightened us both, and many of our friends. It isn't too much to say that that film left a lasting impression, at least on me, with its folk horror imagery. It was during that same year on a particularly snowy day that a thought struck me. Jennifer and I were building our weird snowmen, haphazardly stabbing the snow with an abundance of sticks and twigs, when I saw that these cold effigies somewhat resembled the Wickermen. In a wholly unoriginal portmanteau, I said that we could call them Stickermen. It stuck, no pun intended, and soon enough all the kids at school were using the name. Eventually it spread around, being used by the entire town. I realize it may sound as if I'm getting off track. I started this off as a story that was supposed to be about my husband, so let's pivot back. I don't want to waste your time with how he and I met and what life took us and where, but suffice it to say, we wake up each day and live it very much like the same as the one before. It's always another day spent together, quickly approaching retirement. Our kids are in college, far out of state, and we both have fairly lucrative jobs. Any reasonable person would see that we live comfortably. My husband Fred, however, is not always reasonable. Fred loves his lawn. He loves his trees, his hedges, and, of course, his lawnmower. As anyone who lives in a region that regularly gets snow knows, in winter, you have to abandon your lawn. By the transitive property, Fred hates winter. Last winter was especially snowy. For any winter sports enthusiast, well, it was ideal. Fred was, of course, less than enthused. One innocuous morning, we wake up, start our day, as if it was any typical Saturday. We shower, throw on basic pajamas, and sit with the TV, drinking some coffee. Fred stood up to get a second cup, but something must have caught his eye. He lingered at the window facing our lawn. "What the hell is that?" I barely caught the words. Fred had spoken in a tone low enough that it was as if he'd said them to himself. Curious, I stood up and joined him by the window, peering out to the lawn and the street beyond it. To my bemusement, I saw a singular Stickerman. Not the most creative piece, mind you, but it checks all the boxes. 3 orbs, sticks for hands, and twigs jutting out of peculiar places. "You know exactly what that is, Fred," I replied. "But what's it doing on my lawn? Did you make that?" he said in a half-accusatory tone. "Yes, Fred. I got up in the middle of the night, turned on all the outside lights, marched to the edge of our lawn, and made a Stickerman. You caught me." My tone was half retaliatory in kind. I next assured Fred it was some kid playing a prank, as was our town's tradition. I reminded him of the Stickermen we set up on old people's lawns back in the day. Fred, seemingly assuaged, went back to his coffee gathering, and that was the end of that. Until Sunday. Against the peals of distant church bells, Fred exclaimed again by the front window. So again, I joined him, and this time I was slightly astonished. In total, 4 Stickermen stood upright upon our lawn. Each was different from the next, indicating different sculptors. "Now what the hell is this?" Fred was no longer annoyed. He was incensed. "This is vandalism, Cell. You can't just wander onto someone else's property and do this." Vandalism? Really, Fred, it's a bunch of snow stacked on top of more snow. Calm down and help me with the dishes. Now you see, Fred wasn't the only one who was incensed, as I was growing pretty impatient with his delusions. We spent the rest of the day doing light chores and trying to enjoy the remainder of our short weekend. Fred kept pausing at the window to glance at the Stickermen, as if they would start moving once he stopped watching. When we got into bed, he chuckled and even said it was cute that the 4 sculptures could almost resemble a family. I chuckled back but remarked to myself that they weren't arranged in a familial pose, they were scattered randomly on the lawn. Monday's routine grumblings about starting the work week were compounded with a fresh shout from downstairs. Fred had apparently woken up before me and was already surveying the front yard. My patience was wearing thin at this point as I ambled downstairs. I found Fred with his face pressed up against the glass of our window, and he was wearing a look of disbelief. Not bothering to ask, I approached a different window with the same view. No fewer than 10 Stickermen adorned our lawn. Each was more elaborate than the last with its stick and twig ornamentation. Fred cursed under his breath and went for the landline. I could tell where this was going. "Fred, at least wait until tonight to call the cops," I said in a pleading tone. "Why, so they can start vandalizing the front of the house? Look how close they are, Cell." To his credit, the latest round of sculptures was halfway up the lawn toward our front door, much closer than before. "Honey, it's probably some kids skipping class for some pranks. We can ask around the neighborhood, see if anyone else is having the same problem. This isn't anything to call the police about." It wasn't what Fred wanted to hear, but he relented in the end. Upon returning after work, we saw no additional Stickermen, and that calmed down Fred a bit. We then took a drive around our neighborhood and checked out our neighbors' yards. All we saw were usual Christmas lights, Santa figures, large candy canes. Occasionally there was a Stickerman, but nothing as elaborate as the ones invading our lawn. "Nothing has really changed, huh?" Fred said aloud. "Well, we're a bit older now, but that's about it," I replied. Fred had been dreading his upcoming birthday, and had been concerned about how much time had gotten away from him. I mean, he didn't really say as much, but I noticed him checking his hair in the mirror, picking at his waistline, stretching his back as it ached more, trying to keep up with his kids on the phone. Talking about this with our friends didn't help him. These were just constant reminders of how old we were getting, and they had seen nothing that would shed light on our Stickerman problem. We returned home for a terse dinner and went to bed early as it was already dark out. Our conversation was minimal, as I could tell Fred was not pleased with how the things were unfolding. I promised him it would make much more sense soon, and by next week, he'd forget all about it. Fred grumbled and turned out the last light. That night, I could tell he was restless, and he didn't fall asleep until well into the early hours of the morning, waiting for some noise outside that never came. Tuesday morning's calm was broken by a shattering of glass. I woke up with a start and ran to the kitchen, thinking Fred maybe had injured himself or someone had broken in. His paranoia had started to rub off on me, even though I would never admit that to him. When I reached the kitchen, I saw his favorite beer mug was lying in jagged pieces across the floor. He'd crafted it himself on our honeymoon 20 years ago in Austria. God, it meant so much to him, and to see it broken, it made my heart sink. Before I could ask what happened, he started to yell. Fred was standing in our doorway, fuming and screaming at the scene in front of us. I peered around him and saw that the number of Stickermen had doubled. I'll admit, there's always been a disturbing aspect of this little town tradition, but what I saw in those figures just 3 feet from our door was nothing short of grotesque. These were not the same silly sculptures we made as kids. No, these were horrific. Faces made from rotten food, distorted in frozen agony. Strange carvings I didn't recognize were traced throughout the snow on their bodies. Twigs and sticks arranged in complex patterns strung together with twine. They were ornamented with what looked like small animal bones and teeth. Some portrayed haunting poses that parodied human activities. One was carrying skis, another holding a football. This was no longer cute, and by all means Fred had lost his grip. As I wandered along in between the Stickermen, I tried to make sense of the obscene depictions in front of me. I could hear Fred from our kitchen. He was screaming, I assume on the phone, and then I assume to the sheriff's office. He was demanding that someone be sent right away. Hurriedly, I went back inside, and then could tell that Fred was threatening to sue the precinct. Something that I doubt he'd ever dreamed of in the past. I quickly approached him, and then convinced Fred to put the dispatcher on speakerphone so all three of us could discuss what was happening. The dispatcher was patient, but a little flustered with Fred. There really isn't much crime where we live, and I'm willing to bet that this lady had forgotten exactly what to do when vandalism was reported to her. She explained that without firm proof or a lead, the best the department could do is send a patrol car around 6 p.m. I explained that we thought these pranks were being orchestrated later at night than that, so patrol at 6? Well, that wouldn't achieve anything. The dispatcher, who we finally got the name of, Patricia, elaborated that with construction out there on Route 100, well, there wasn't much manpower to spare. I calmly asked that we speak to her supervisor, as we weren't getting anywhere in this conversation. Patricia hesitated, then put us on a hold. This is what I remember from the rest of the call when the county sheriff picked up. This is Sheriff Roberts. Is that you, Fred? Hi, Sheriff. This is Celeste. Fred's here, too. Well, good morning, Celeste. I gotta say, you two are the last folks I would expect to make a call like this. Now, what's this about demon snowmen? Fred spoke in a measured but tense voice. Bill, you know me. We were on varsity team together. Have I ever been unreasonable? Well, no, Fred. I suppose not. Then please just hear us out. I'm gonna say some things that aren't gonna sound quite right, but I need you to believe us. I have to say, I have never heard my husband so desperate. Well, all right. I don't know how much I can do, but go ahead. Bill sounded sincere enough, but I could tell he was more concerned about Fred than about the alleged crime. You see, it's like we told Patricia, someone is sneaking onto my lawn every night and putting more and more of these things up. God, these guys are getting more ballsy. Every night, it seems like more pop up. I don't know, soon, maybe, they'll be breaking into our house, and who knows what will happen then. Well, now, Fred, has anything been damaged? Have any notes or threats been left behind? Do you have any enemies that could have done this? I know a man's house is his castle, but this isn't really something I would call a cause for alarm. Damn it, Bill, how many years have you known me? I've never run a red light in this town. I pay my taxes. I keep my head down. I'm a good goddamn citizen, and all I'm asking you for is some due diligence. Well, Jesus, Fred. Why haven't you just taken the snowblower to him, cleared the lawn? It's just a bunch of snow and twigs. And what? Erase all the evidence? How stupid do you think I am? I decided it was time to chime in. Sheriff, this is Celeste. We don't want to raise a fuss, but we just don't feel safe right now. I waited a moment before adding. I know Barbara had that scare with the black bears a couple years ago. I'm not saying this is bears, but we wouldn't be calling if things weren't out of the ordinary. Bill was quiet for several moments. After a long pause, he continued, Okay, Celeste, for Barbara's sake, I'll put something together. But I gotta do this by the book. I can't just run things up and around. I'm gonna need you both to come in, file a 5707 form first thing tomorrow. Give this some time in case the pranksters decide they've had their fun. But I'll get a deputy here in the next couple of days to do a stakeout. Mostly me, to be honest, thanked the sheriff, and we tried to lighten the mood of everything before hanging up. Fred and Bill did a bit of catching up, And the truth is, while Bill and Fred used to be friends back in high school, none of us had done much speaking or interacting since Barbara's passing. Fred knew how much he was asking of Bill, and having someone else to rely on was only further hurting his pride. I tried to calm him down, but Fred stormed off to his study, slamming the door. He then set off for work without a word. That day I called in sick, and I went through our yard, taking pictures of these Stickermen to include with the forums. The rest of the day was spent preparing for Fred's birthday breakfast to take place the following day. When Fred got home from work, he placed his hand on mine and we went directly to bed. He mentioned that he wasn't hungry and he had had a long day. So, by myself, I sat by the TV, trying to distract the racing thoughts that kept running through my head. Eventually, after some time, I had nodded off. Wednesday started with a violent shock. Shouts and screams from the yard shook me awake. I stumbled to the front door and saw my husband raving like a lunatic at nothing at all. He was bashing into the Stickermen with a baseball bat, yelling at them, spitting on the remains of their snowy corpses. They'd tripled in number. The yard was full of them, and Fred nearly tripped over a few. They stood still, taking every hit and insult with morbid defiance. I called out to Fred, begging him to come inside. He largely ignored me, except to yell the word 60 over and over again. I acknowledged that and still begged for him to just come inside where we could talk, at least to grab a sweater. I started to get too cold, so I closed the door. I called 911 and explained frantically that my husband wasn't well. I was afraid that he'd freeze outdoors or hurt himself. The dispatcher put me on hold while connecting to the police. I looked back outside just in time to see Fred driving off in his car, speeding away recklessly. I stayed on the phone until the authorities came back on the line. I was incoherent, crying, not able to see with the tears clouding my vision. I recounted everything in hiccuping gasps that had happened. Eventually, it was passed on to Sheriff Bill. As he came on, he said that he had already made sure to put out an alert to find Fred and would keep me updated. The rest of the day is a blur of me sitting alone at my kitchen table, waiting by her phone. It was only later that night that it finally rang, and I answered it quickly. It was Bill. He somberly informed me that they'd finally found Fred's car, abandoned by the woods. It was still running. Bill assured me that the police would continue searching for the next 24 hours, but at that time he had nothing else to report. I sobbed into my hands, shaking, unsure of what to do with myself. I picked at the birthday cake that sat abandoned on our kitchen table, a big number 60 in chocolate frosting, sitting motionless. They never found my husband. I'm sure he's gone. I just want answers. I want to know why he ran off, why someone was tormenting us with Stickermen, even if we could find any sign of him. Hell, I would settle just for his remains, so I could at least know what had happened. I need to put this to rest. If there's anyone out in Vermont that can tell me anything, I would be so grateful.
The Stickermen was written by Abysme, narration by Lex Reckless, editing, mastering, and original music by Abysme. Comprehensive links below. YouTube.com/Creepypasta is a collaborative channel. Please subscribe if you want to follow our content. If you want to support the channel, please consider liking, commenting, and sharing this video with like-minded members of the community.